Colleagues, good afternoon and good evening. My name is Charles H.F. Davis III. I'm an assistant professor here at the University of Michigan in higher education. And my research and teaching primarily focus on issues of race, racism, and resistance in American higher education and its social context. I'm specifically interested in understanding the role of new and digital media in the everyday organizing practices of contemporary college students. I'm extremely excited to serve as today's moderator for our conversation that is as important as it is timely. The event title, Global Roots of Resistance, is a reference to Makubong Nkomo's 1984 book that investigates student culture and activism in South African universities between the 1960s and the 1980s. In the book, Nkomo found that various external factors beyond the university structure influenced Black South African students to develop a broader position against the apartheid state. Not surprisingly, what had been occurring within broader South African society was mirrored by its educational institutions, as Bantu education often produced a subordinated, semi-literate Black labor class. Such stratification, as facilitated by African ethnic universities under apartheid, as Nkomo writes, created a climate and conditions for cultivating resistance, especially in a context where Black South African students remained underserved by mostly white faculty and staff. In no ways dissimilar, the United States American college students have a storied history of resisting injustice on campus and beyond. Turning to Ibram X. Kendi's earlier work on the Black campus movement, Black students at historically Black colleges and universities, a parallel set of institutions similar to African ethnic universities, also fought for access to an education that would provide, as W.E.B. Du Bois referenced in 1933, the means to live a life. During a similar period of Jim and Jane Crow segregation in the United States and the ongoing de facto segregation across the South during the 1950s and 60s, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee emerged as the vanguard of the waning civil rights movement, ushering in a new youthful era of Black power. And in 1968, at the University of Michigan specifically, the Black Action Movement protests were organized in response to the lack of compositional diversity and poor institutional support from the university itself, a fight that continues today. Although written nearly 3 decades ago, Nkomo's book remains relevant with regard to the ongoing fights for justice, both in South Africa and here in the United States. As Dr. Janetta B. Cole suggests in her foreword of the book, where there is opposition, there will always be resistance. And so it has continued to be. Today, we are joined by student activists who continue the legacy of resistance across the historical spectrum. In this particular moment, where the world publicly wrestles with the ontological terror of anti-Blackness, and while Black lives continue to be subject to state and state-sanctioned violence, these incredible student activists are fighting for our fundamental right to affordable, culturally responsive education and a post-secondary future in which we can all be free. I would now like to introduce, or allow rather the panelists to introduce themselves who are joining us. And if we could start with Vusi, please introduce yourself to our folks who are joining us for today's conversation.
Am I audible?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, hi everyone. My name is Vusi, and I'm a student at Wits University. I'm studying towards education, and I form part and parcel of the discussion as a South African student activist. Thank you.
Thank you. Addie.
Hi, I'm Adetola Ojo, also known as Addie. I'm an undergraduate student at the University of Michigan studying biopsychology, cognition, and neuroscience, and minoring in business and gender and health. Yeah, I think that's it.
Thank you. Sino.
Hi, I am Sinotlolo Odidi Mahlachana. I am a National Diploma in Bachelor of Technology Journalism graduate from the Durban University of Technology. I am a leader of the Global Youth Parliament South Africa and a provincial leader of the South African Students Congress in South Africa. And I am a panelist.
Wonderful. Thank you for each of your introductions. I'd like to start today's conversation where I left off in talking about sort of the longer historical trajectory of this work. So often when we think about protests and their emergence, they're often considered to be episodic and that they're not connected to a longer tradition of organized resistance, which we know not to be the case. I'm wondering if you might be able to speak to how the historical legacy of activism, both on campus and within broader society, informs your resistance work today.
I assume that question was meant for me, Dr. Charles?
Yes, you can jump right in.
All right, so it has been our historical motto because I represent the South African Students' Congress, and it has been our historical motto as a product of the student movement that we are members of the community before we're a student. And as such, we identify institutions of higher learning as microcosms of the societies that we stem from, particularly in the South African context. Universities have come to exemplify the failure of transformation within these institutions and the lasting legacy of apartheid, which has been and continues to be defined by institutional racism, by institutional classism, and Eurocentrism, largely exist within our institutions of higher learning. And this discourse is also shaped by colonialism in all its manifestations. These historical trajectories that various African societies have experienced continue to play a significant role in our contemporary trajectory as they affect how our educational matters are treated today. And so this is what informs our resistance work, the fact that there are still taints of the colonialism and the apartheid that continue to find expression in our institutional policies under the guise of a free and under the guise of a non-racial society. And this is most prevalent in the curriculum that is taught in these institutions. And it continues to show in the face of the quality of our curriculum and the commodification of the education system. But because we also understand that in many ways, student movements have a lot in common. And so a number have shared an opposition to rolling out of reforms in higher education and the repositioning it as a private good rather than a public one. And that is why in our work of resistance, we join hands with progressive student formations internationally, such as the Southern African Students' Union, such as the World Federation of Democratic Youth, such as the Global Campaign for Education and the International Union of Students. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm just going to have you teach the rest of my activism and social movements course for the semester because you've just given us all the gems like right up front. I really appreciate that. Particularly as you were talking about this sort of longstanding tradition of what we call in the campus climate literature curricular disregard, right? And the extent to which we are not represented in how we talk about obviously the history of our particular nations and our contributions, which is no more pertinent than here in the United States celebrating Black History Month, but that ongoing sort of pathway. And Addie, I'm wondering if you might talk about your experience here at the University of Michigan and how some of the themes that Sinu brought up are emblematic of what you and many folks within the Black Student Union have been working for here.
Okay, thank you. So for the Black Student Union, we work, we kind of have a history of creating movements on campus. We had Black Action Movements 1, 2, and 3. And after the summer that we had here, after the death of George Floyd and all of the protesting that ensued after that, we actually had kicked around the idea of potentially starting up another movement. But again, just because COVID and everything else, we kind of wanted everybody to be safe on a health standpoint as well. So we kind of had to take different avenues. But at Michigan, there's a lot that we want to see changed. And there's a lot that we've asked for. And in the past, there has been success. But it seems that there's kind of this slow regression back to what it was before administration had implemented some of the things that were asked for in previous movements. So what we really focus on first with the Black Student Union is listening to the community and how they feel about the campus climate. and seeing what we can do to make people feel more welcome on campus to begin with. And then we kind of worry about going to administration and trying to, enact change there. So realistically, what we kind of look to do is create a cohesive set of demands that we're kind of asking for with administration. And typically we send a group of 4 people that are kind of the core to ask questions and be there with administration, but we kind of work across all of administration too. We don't just work with President Schlichel. We look at all the different colleges and everything too, because there's discrepancies within each college. So we kind of try to work at several different angles, but something that we have kind of kept very close to home is the activism on campus, doing things such as, disrupting campus activities if we can, without repercussions. But we also try to join forces with other campus activist leaders. So there was a whole slew of things that happened actually last semester, and it was really impressive to see how campus came together. There was a graduate student strike. There was the People of Color Liberation Front. And so we try to, I guess there's power in numbers. And so we try to be, very inclusive. But I think that the other thing with the Black Student Union is, although we do serve Black students on campus, we recognize that you can't fight for just one cause. We try to fight for everybody, because that's, that's what we would want other people to help us with. So there's just a lot of different things that we try to do. Again, with this year, it's been a little bit stalled, and we're seeing a pattern of kind of disregard from administration. So we're trying to combat that in other ways, but it's been kind of challenging and actually quite exhausting to be on campus, especially this year. So kind of have to take different angles, I guess.
Thanks so much for that. So you talk a bit about, sort of both the breadth and the depth of the work that's taking place here. And Lucy, I want to engage you into our conversation as well. And wondering if you can speak a bit about your experiences with regard to your activism. And I think particularly within the context, as many folks definitely in the United States are probably most familiar with the Fees Must Fall and Roads Must Fall campaigns that were happening across South Africa. But what connections can you perhaps draw between what's happening, I guess, more globally within the context of this Black Lives Matter moment and what you all have been organizing for continuously in South Africa?
For me, as someone who's been part of the Fees Must Fall campaign, what I can say is that the struggles are the same, although the demographics can change here and there. But I think we're all facing similar problems as means to that relates to access and transformation. So basically, with the Fees Must Fall movement, what we would have seen is that there was an issue around access. So a lot of students were being financially excluded because they could not afford the fees. And through that, one can say that we can draw parallels with the student movements in the US, because it's an issue of the commodification of education. So the main debate was, we demand free quality education. And perhaps what's interesting to note is that the Fees Must Fall movement has been a battle of ideas. There would be those that are coming from the Pan-Africanist / Black consciousness stance that would be saying that we are demanding free, quality, decolonized education. And there'd be those that are coming from a Marxist-Leninist perspective to say that we demand a free, decommodified education. Then there's people like me, of course, who do not denounce any of the two ideas, but perhaps look at what's important. What would be important first is access. Because if we tend to say that we are decolonizing, in other words, we are removing all of the colonial elements in the university space, in other words, dealing with the curriculum, moving from a Eurocentric approach to a more Afrocentric approach. The biggest problem would be that even if we could change this university to Steve Biko University, the biggest problem that would have to deal with would be a matter of access. In other words, before we even decolonize the space, we'd have to look at the element of education, because we believe that education is a right. It's a basic human right. Everyone deserves education. So I think what would be important in this debate is first removing the money element, then perhaps moving towards the decolonization of the curriculum and all the colonial structures. So it's a battle of ideas because it's a continuous thing. Even now, we are still faced with issues of financial exclusion. But for now, I'll end it here.
Thanks for providing that clarification for us. And I think the parallels you draw were really, really important. And so, here we are kind of dealing with this student debt crisis that disproportionately affects Black folks, right, in terms of accessibility, where in a similar way, many of us have been provided, quote unquote, access to institutions vis-a-vis the federal student loan system, and yet are often, entrapped in this racial debt trap of debt that we can't get out of, on top of having what I imagine is similar, racially divided labor market, right? In the sense that we are both graduating with more debt than our white counterparts, and we're entering into a racist labor system where we can't get jobs to even be able to repay that debt. And so the financial piece, I think, is a really critical dimension that has to be racialized, right? It's not something that sort of exists unto itself. And so I think you point that out really beautifully in the things that you just said. So I want to pivot just a little bit. Much of our ability to both have this conversation today and to even just be aware of what's going on in these different geographic spaces is the result of social media, right? And also, I think the expansiveness of these movements has really been driven by the way that social media can be mobilized as a resource by these movements to achieve their goals. Perhaps someone can speak to how social media has helped sort of create this global connection, but also how it has influenced your strategies and tactics to take on your institutions.
Perhaps I would tend to disagree with you in terms of the use of social media at a global scale. And I'll say this because I think we are failing to connect our societal issues at a global scale. I mean, here in South Africa, for example, we were in solidarity with the US when there was an issue of George Floyd. But a similar thing happened here in South Africa, whereby a member of the civil society by the name of Collins Khosa was brutally killed by the military. But we did not tend to receive the same energy that we gave when it was the George Floyd issue. So I'm just drawing these two parallels to show that, yes, at a domestic level, we have been able to raise consciousness amongst the members of the civil society. We have been able to tell our story, but at a global scale, we haven't been able to link our societal issues. And for me, that would stand out.
Sino?
I believe that because it has been argued that the student protests of the last decade or so, or the past few years, particularly the Fees Must Fall movement and the Black Lives Matter movement, even though it was not student related, can be seen as globalized to a certain extent. This is because of the ways in which they have influenced each other and the importance of the borderless technology, which has been assisted by the info media ecosystem, such as social media, which have facilitated much of the action. So this can be seen in the way in which the Twitter hashtag Fees Must Fall in South Africa and the Roads Must Fall have stimulated protests even across Africa and beyond. Equally with the Black Lives Matter, which stimulated protests even beyond the borders of the United States of America. And so there is an undoubted importance of new technologies in facilitating communication between students, activists across national borders. And student-led and general movements have thus used social media as a platform to participate in political issues or of relevance in the contemporary global context, which reflect a form of sub-activism and which reflect a stand in solidarity with one another beyond national borders, and also being able to participate in participatory citizenship. But even though this has been rebuked by many as slacktivism, which allows individuals to participate in social activism at the click of a button, it has proven to be active in our current infomedia ecosystem, particularly in the Black Lives Matter and FISMASOL campaigns, because it boosted the protest turnout and it supported fundraising campaigns. And this has broadened mobilization across these movement endeavors.
Thank you for that. Really important points, particularly the reduction of what's been happening to this notion of slacktivism and pushing back on that, really to think about how activism through social media can be utilized in its own right. Nteko just joined us, and so I'd like to invite him into the conversation. If you might want to just provide a brief introduction for folks of where you're joining us from and your work, and then we will continue to go with our line of questioning. Nteko, are you still there?
Nkateko. Nkateko.
They may have stepped away. So Adi, I'll bring you in to provide some additional insight in terms of your perspective of how this has maybe connected you to a global understanding of Black Lives Matter in this particular moment.
Yeah, so again, because I think the circumstances of this past year of 2020 made social media that much more important for activism on a global scale. You know, in the middle of a pandemic, realistically, staying informed and also still having, you know, like, I guess, playing your part in these movements was sometimes contradictory. A lot of people might not have felt safe going out, but I think that social media has connected people in a way that I don't think, you know, like a very unprecedented way of connecting people, just as, you know, heard that word a lot in the past year. But I think that that really has been the game changing like aspect to these movements. As stated earlier with the Black Lives Matter, even though it kind of felt like it started in the United States, once you saw the kind of ripple effect through social media on a global scale, I have family members in the UK and in Nigeria, and they all pretty much knew what was happening and the turmoil that was going on in the country. And that to me was kind of crazy, just because they sometimes do things before I did. But social media has been extremely important. And I remember seeing images from across the globe, just kind of saying, with the way that things were going here in June and July, like the world was really watching. But I think that the other thing that I thought was really powerful about social media is that one movement fed another to a degree. I think back to End SARS, when that hashtag went up, seeing all of that imagery and all of the others, there were several other movements that kind of fed into each other, and the momentum of one movement was able to kind of help get another movement going and continue the fight for social justice. And so that to me has been very important, because I think that as we continue to build these networks, you know, the more, I guess, people and interaction that you have on social media, it feels like the more power and the more momentum that you can put behind these movements, and the more people are listening and watching. And that's really what you kind of need to create an environment for social justice and change. I guess on a scale for the Black Student Union for Michigan, social media was extremely important in communicating mass messages for what we were envisioning for the next school year, for, again, talking with people that were on campus, or even if they weren't returning to campus, but people that were part of our Michigan community, on how we wanted to come into this school year, what we wanted to accomplish, if there were things that we wanted to change with administration. I know that something that was a really big point for returning to campus in a pandemic was safe, health-informed return to campus. And despite everything that happened with the death of George Floyd and kind of that turned into defunding the police, Michigan decided to actually partner with Ann Arbor Police Department to bring students back. And so that was our first big moment to kind of talk with administration. And again, that was kind of a social media push was, if you don't agree with this, this is what you can do to take action. Even if you don't want to be necessarily directly involved, the person to go talk to administration, there's so many other things that you can make happen just by clicking through these things or taking these couple steps. And I think that that's the other thing that's really powerful about social media is you can get you can push a lot of education with just a couple clicks. You can send resources faster, you can share images faster, you can do all of these things faster and get a larger audience than ever before. And I think that that's something that's really just kind of the core of how these movements have been so successful in the past year.
Thanks for that, Adi. So I'm going to go to back to Kateko, who's now with Vusi. And if you could just provide an introduction of yourself for the folks that are here, that'd be really, really helpful in terms of how you're joining us in this work. I think you're still muted.
Okay. Nimatekwana, good evening to everyone. My name is Nkateko Muroiwa. I'm a student leader at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. My broad focus is on access and success of the previously disadvantaged students. And in South Africa, when you speak of such, you're speaking of African students. I'm using the word African because intentionally so, because African students or African people are both in the diaspora and at home in Africa. Those are people who have my skin color. So I represent their interests. And it does not mean that there are people who also represent people who don't have my skin color. It simply means that in South Africa, we understand the reality that there must be a transformation agenda. So in the transformation agenda, we understand that African people must be put first because they were put last in the previous system. That's why I am saying I represent African students. And in the movement that we've run, my movement, not my movement per se, our movement has been informed by historical movements. 1968, Steve Biko. I know that Steve Biko is known in your world. Steve Biko started a movement called the South African Student Organization. It was a movement for Africans only. And it was not because that we do not accept other colors. It was because we understood that Africans must be put first in South Africa. And it was because we understood that it was not supposed to be a point of debate. It was supposed to be a point that everyone understood. You can't come into someone's house and say that they must put themselves last. So that was how we understood. That's how we understood our movement. Thank you, Program Director.
Thank you for that. That was such an important point. And as we think about that in the United States context, there's often this debate within the public that Black lives, by juxtaposition to all lives, and what we know that all lives matter ultimately means is whether white folks specifically who are pushing this rhetoric do not recognize just what you said, and that in fact, Black folks have almost always and consistently been put last. And so what does it mean to actually assert their dignity in public, to recognize that they have consistently been disproportionately told that they do not matter, and a need to center on that for us to have our own liberation, for one as a people, but also for the nation to reckon with its original sense. So I want to talk a bit about, Addie brought up this situation here in the United States in terms of the return to campus that was often facilitated by police departments, both at the local and campus level, and that being sort of a larger conversation about the role that the state plays when it comes to issues that are happening on college and university campuses, but specifically their role in engaging in various levels of suppression of student activists. We know here that campus police particularly, their genesis starts with the emergence of trying to quell student protest, most of which was done by Black and brown students. And so I'm wondering, maybe Sano, if you could jump in to talk about maybe some of the consequences of being engaged in this type of activity and how the state or your institution has responded to being an activist. So often, I think we romanticize what it means to do this work, and we don't think about the very real and material consequences that people experience, particularly at the hands of the state or their institution, when they are trying to engage in things that would otherwise be repressive or suppressive of political dissent. There we go.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Dr. Charles. One development that we've identified is the fact that as protests, the student protests increase, so to have police brutality towards the students. And this is influenced by both the state and the institutions of higher learning, which are continuously trying to depoliticize the institutions of higher learning themselves. And this has resulted in students equally using disruptive techniques to shut down their campuses until their demands are met. Sometimes universities have responded by increasing securities on campuses and seeking a wide range of interdicts against the students themselves, and even deploying private security guards. And there have been multiple instances where the police are quick to use violence, which had been the case in the Fees Must Fall movement, even though I was not a part of it because I had not yet accessed university then. And these interactions would also socialize students to resort to violence. And this led to an imposition of an injustice frame where the state comes to be seen as fundamentally unjust. And arresting multiple student leaders, expelling them from institutions of higher learning and cutting their academic journeys short. And this resulted in many student leaders and student activists acquiring criminal records because of their student activism within institutions of higher learning, which has made it difficult for them to acquire employment outside of their university, one, because they do not carry any qualification, and two, because of the criminal record themselves. And so evidence of this is seen from victims of the state and institutional repression, such as our various victims like Bongingosi Kanyile from the Durban University of Technology, who's currently under house arrest from those Fees Must Fall protests, and Kanya Tsegecho, who recently came out of prison, I think 2 years ago, and I think he's still under house arrest, and Mcebo Dlamini from Wits University, and many others whose names have gone unmentioned.
Thank you for that. I think it's such an important piece that you mentioned of how the state is usually the initiator of violence to which folks who are already considered vulnerable have to respond with the only language that the state understands, which tends to be violence. But so often the media narrative, right, would shape and suggest that these were violent protests that in fact were peaceful until the police actually showed up. Boosie, did you want to jump in to add anything there?
No, just to add that the state in its nature is violent. And through its creation, just as Lenin said, that it is a product of class antagonisms. We certainly do not expect the state to hear our criterion call because in its nature, it was not designed for the downtrodden, but it was designed to serve those who own the means of production. Those that are privy to it. So it does not come as a shock, but I just wanted to speak about the issue of institutions of higher learning who've isolated and victimized the former student leaders through academic administration. And you find you find a situation whereby you have to regularly check your marks and other assessments because you were once at loggerheads with a certain lecture when you were shutting down the university. So that comes into play because this battle is an ongoing one. You understand? So yeah, for now, I'll just add on this. All right.
So to that point, I think one of the things that we've seen here in the United States have been this emergence of what I've talked about, at least in my own work, is protest policies that aim to ultimately institutionalize white supremacy, right? That seeks out to criminalize student activists. And often one of the sort of punishments associated with that are being enforced by institutions is this desire to suspend, if not fully expel, as you all were both talking, students from their educational institutions, which also then has implications on whether they'll be able to finish or continue either at their own university to be reinstated, or whether on their academic record it will show an expulsion, and they would then prevent them to have access to other institutions of higher learning. And so really thinking about how the college or university serves itself as an apparatus of the state or an extension of the state to engage in some of these various forms of punishment is definitely something we want to be thinking about moving forward. So I want to talk a little bit now to think about really this higher education for a Black public good. And so, you talked about, this notion of the private versus the public good, but also in thinking about that, what are one's own aspirations as someone who's engaged in this work, given that I think for most folks, they're not majoring, say, in student activism, right? Like that's not sort of the particular professional outcome that one might desire, but how these sensibilities are often woven into what people aspire to do or how they desire to approach their work. Ade, I wonder for you as someone who's in a business school, for example, thinks about the relationship between what you do as a student activist and then how you might pursue your career in ways that might be very different than your counterparts who are leaving the Ross School of Business to take on, ventures at other parts that have nothing to do with social justice.
Yeah, so that's something that's actually the reason why I decided to apply to Ross was because I really have a passion for medicine, and so I want to go to med school. But something that I'm also very passionate about is health disparities and inequalities, not just necessarily in the United States, but across the world. And so something that I've always been passionate about is bringing things that are basically basic, like living necessities to everyone on a pretty large scale. And so part of that is recognizing that not everything that we medicalize is necessarily a problem with the individual on a medical level. Social justice plays a huge role in the wellness of people everywhere. You could be a very well-off Black person in America and still be predisposed to hundreds of disease that somebody with just as much or even less, material wealth than you would never be predisposed to their entire life. And so that's something that I've always been kind of fascinated with, especially just with the household I grew up with. And my mom is white and my dad is a Nigerian immigrant. And so seeing the way that their lives were different because of who they were, and then being raised in a household where you kind of saw both sides play out. And so I've always thought about that. And it wasn't until college where I really realized there's something that you have to get to the core. I think that in America, we're really reactive and we try to kind of remedy the symptoms of what is social inequality and social injustice. And nobody ever really gets to the disease. Nobody diagnoses the disease in America. And so I think that that's what my whole life essentially is going to come down to, is pointing out all of the flaws in the system and trying to find ways to combat that, and having a more proactive approach. Is if we institute these things for people of color, specifically Black people, or, you know, other people that are at a disadvantage, how does that increase the likelihood that they're going to have a better life, you know, later on? And so my biggest thing with the business degree is healthcare is also a business in America, as we all know. And so I don't know that it's not just going to be, it's going to take a lot more than just me, but understanding the business side of medicine, I think will make me a much better equipped person to deal with social justice and justice in medicine. If you can deconstruct the profit margins and understand why the current structure is the way that it is, you're just going to be a much more well-rounded person. You're going to be able to say, okay, well, maybe we should do this instead of this. And you're coming at it with an educational standpoint and you're speaking their language when you do it. And so that's really my motivation to have a business degree and an MD degree. And so that's really kind of the way that I look at all my activism too, is the way that these different things that we're dealing with. I mean, even if you are not the direct victim of racism, you know, if you haven't had any terrible interactions with the police, I have never had any altercation with authority or the state or anything like that, but having to see people that look like you all the time and being bombarded by these messages that this is who you are as a Black person in America or even in the world, you know, really does take a mental and emotional toll on you, which becomes a physical toll. And so I think that that's something that I kind of take with me when I'm speaking with the Black Student Union or representing my college for our central student government and all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So those psychosocial traumas that are associated with what Patricia Hill Collins calls controlling images often, which we know, based on all the media, both Black folks in the United States and Black folks globally, and even how media in the United States depicts Black Africans specifically, right, all have an impact on, I think, obviously our identity and how we are shaped into seeing ourselves. And I think in addition to that, the consistent disparate outcomes. And so, as you were talking about sort of the public health piece, we can only but think about the disparate impact that COVID-19 has had on Black people globally. And more especially when we think about vaccine rollouts, the extent to which those of us who have been most vulnerable are often disenfranchised and lack access to something like that. So it would certainly be a really important aspect to bring into the business and medical world to talk about some of these things in a way that advances racial equity. Others that might want to chime in a bit about your own trajectories and how you see your role after university based on what you've experienced and learned from being a student activist.
Mine is going to be very short, because I am a journalism student, and so I'm very interested in an interest in development journalism per se, because when I look at the context of the South African media, it's very problematic. For instance, Vusi would know because he's from the Wits University, which is one of the best university in Africa and probably the world. And when you do research on the Fees Must Fall movement in South Africa, if you go on your Google Scholar and research articles, you find that it states that that's where the Fees Must Fall initiated at Wits University. So there's some sort of privilege where our media is concerned, and where it chooses to report on certain victims. There's a perfect victim, there are perfect institutional victims as well. And it does not give a true reflection of what is actually happening. There's rather a direct effect model and an agenda setting. And we also see this, we usually see this when we talk about gender-based violence that is happening in the country. A media is going to report on a particular gender-based violence case, and in the following day and in the following weeks, multiple media publications are going to be reporting on gender-based violence, creating a moral panic to the citizens that gives an impression that gender-based violence has actually increased when that is not the case. And when you go to the statistics, it proves that actually gender-based violence has decreased. But because of the media's agenda setting of constantly reporting on something that they feel is trending, and if it believes it leads. And then you find a lot of people going into the street and protesting for something when there are actually developments in that particular field. So that's basically what I want to look at. I'm more interested not in participating in the field of journalism, but in participating in the research behind the South African media and how we can develop that.
Yeah, I really appreciate you making that connection of the role that research and data play into the media narratives that are often put forward. And it's so interesting of how the media in many ways sensationalizes things that ultimately lead to a profit generation for them, but in some ways also spurn folks to engage in mobilization if they have not otherwise seen it before. And so much of that, is tied to this notion that if it doesn't happen to one personally, or you don't have a personal connection to that narrative, or you don't see that narrative is represented in a way that's consistent with other people's lived experiences, that one might be less likely to engage in forms of social unrest, whether on campus or within society more generally. Nkateko or Mbusi, would you like to also share with us your own thoughts and perspectives of your trajectory after university and how your experience as student activist has shaped that trajectory? There we go. We're good.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Oh, sorry, Nkateko has left us. He has to address the urgent student issue because his house committee here.
No worries. Thank you.
So I could not hear the question. I have a problem with this device.
If you could just talk a bit about how your experience as a student activist informs where you think you will go after you leave university.
Look, Davis, I don't think consciousness is a on and off button that you can switch on. Once you are conscious of the societal injustices, you're taken. So for me, besides my teaching profession, I think it's known that most revolutionaries came from the teaching profession. I would like to embark on trade unionism, particularly focus on fighting for the rights of workers, because I think we can't de-link student issues and worker issues. There's only one global system, which is capitalism, and there's only one class struggle, of which it's the poor, it's between the rich and the poor, and the worlds of the haves and the have-nots. So for me, I would like to continue my activism towards advocating for workers in the world of trade unionism.
Great, thank you for that. A really instructive point for sure about not just where we tend to see those who are engaged in this work. And as you said, many educators are a part of that process, but also this notion that consciousness isn't a thing one turns on and turns off, right? Sort of once you've been revealed what the truth is, it's very hard to deny that. As James Baldwin has often written about the experience here in the United States, to be a Negro in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be in a state of rage almost all of the time. And I think that's very much a thing that continues to guide each of us in this work consistently. And so what I would like to do now is to get us an opportunity to do some breakout rooms with the individual panelists. And so I think we have those maybe set up. Let me just double check here for support staff.
Yeah, we have 3 breakout rooms set up, ready to go.
Okay, great. So we can go ahead and open up those rooms, and this will just provide an opportunity for us to engage around some of the topics that have been shared today, but also to engage in some conversation with this respective panelist. And so you have all as participants been somewhat randomly assigned for the ease. I think we've had upwards of 90 folks at any given time join us. And so we will take just a bit of time to do that before we kind of debrief for the rest of today's conversation and for the rest of the week of events here. All right, so we are back from our breakouts. Thank you all so much for indulging us in that brief exercise. We've lost a few folks along the way, which is quite all right. But as we begin to close out, I want to invite our panelists back in to just share a bit about what you all discussed maybe in your breakout rooms, but also what you might leave us with as we all begin to transition back into the day-to-day throes of this work. And maybe we'll start with Vusi, and then we'll go to Ade, and then to Sino. I think you're still muted there. There we go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thanks, Charles. I think from my breakout session, from the entire conversation, actually, what I've learned is that there's so much that is similar in the student movements that are here in South Africa, and also student movements in the US, and also how the state responds as means to silence the work of student activism. I think we can draw so many parallels in discussing that. And if the response to social movement is the same, it means that the plight and our needs are also similar. Also, I think from what I've learned and what I've been engaging on from the breakouts is the progress that we've made so far ever since the beginning of Fees Must Fall in 2015 up until now. And we've discussed how the curriculum has changed, and also the university structures in terms of building beings' names, and also the university being much more conscious towards the different demographics that are at play, and also the different socio-economic backgrounds. And I can say that we've spoken about how the state has responded ever since we embarked on the Fees Must Fall. And I think we've agreed that it's although there are achievements, but it's not yet Uhuru, not by a long shot from our end. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Really appreciate that, right? Progress is relative. And although we've made some gains, like we have not yet achieved that overall vision that we're all fighting for. Addie, do you want to jump in? Then Sino, you can close us out. So there we go.
Yes. So in our breakout room, we kind of talked first about how the curriculum structure accommodates for the discrepancies, I guess, between people of color in the classroom and also non-people of color, white people in the classroom, and how it seems that there's different ways of thinking. There's kind of an indigenous and a Western means of thinking, which was specifically applied to math and math curriculum, and how it seems like the Western curriculum really just caters to the capitalist way of using math. It's in context of business and a means to create profit or, materialistic gains, which is something that I hadn't even kind of considered. So that was really insightful. But we also talked about kind of history and the way history is taught, I guess, specifically in a K-12 means prior to college, and what that kind of implies with the way that is taught, which is something that I have thought a lot about. Everything right down to like the way, I guess, the world map is represented in the United States, how the United States is disproportionately bigger than everything else, like it's relative to. And so that's just, something else. And even though the curriculum, I think everybody would benefit from being, told a different way, they say history is told from the viewpoint of the victors. And I think historically in America, people in the United States or that, conquered the United States were the ones telling the story. And I think that some of the history could be rewritten and it would be more beneficial that way for students. But then we also did talk about briefly how student activists kind of maintain good mental, emotional, and physical well-being with kind of carrying their communities on their back and what that looks like, making sure that they're doing the best that they can for themselves so that they can continue to provide for their community, which is a really big part, I guess, of continuing to be active on campus specifically.
Thank you. And Sino.
Thank you. In the group, we spoke about, there was one participant who spoke about the fact that not a lot of Americans are paying attention to what is happening in South Africa. So we basically spoke on how even in South Africa, not a lot of student activists and student formations are aware of what is happening with the student formations in the United States of America. And that this cannot only be reduced to hashtag Black Lives Matter, because there is a lot that is happening even within the public institutions. And so we spoke about how we can best create alliances, establish practical relationships, and not just be visible on social media, but actually have standing relationships and form alliances with one another as student formations. We also spoke about how non-Black students or non-Black individuals, whether do they feel welcome in these established platforms and organizations within the institutions of higher learning, and whether do they feel that they have a responsibility or a part to play in addressing things of such as the social and the economic disparities and the racial injustices that exist. And there was a lot of appreciation coming back from our non-Black counterparts, rather, who feel that they now better understand, even through these conversations, the struggles that are experienced by Black students, and that even if they can be a part of these conversations and platforms, that they cannot fully experience what Black students experience, but that they could also play a part in addressing and standing in solidarity with Black students. And I also just wanted, I then wanted to find out whether, like in South Africa, because Eddie spoke of, I think, the Black Students Union in the University of Michigan, and I wanted to find out whether is there a possibility of establishing student movements or organizations that allow both races, Black and white, like the one which I am a part of in the South African Union of Students, which is a broad church and allows people who come from different stratas of society to fall under one organization, and so they can better understand the societies that they come from, and better understand and acknowledge the privileges that they have, and how they can better stand in solidarity with those who do not have these privileges. And one participant also mentioned the fact that instead of creating, or rather establishing these platforms, how about we develop the structures that already exist into being able to welcome all races to stand in solidarity against the issues that we're faced with. Thank you.
Thank you each for that recap. So many different important points were talked about in your small group sessions that I think are really instructive as we consider how and what ways to move forward, particularly in collaboration. I hope that this will definitely not be the last time that we can continue to build both here and in South Africa. And so I want to just take this particular moment to thank each of our panelists for their awesome contributions today. And I'll ask you just to stick around a little bit for after the event for something that we just need to do separately. But as we continue to think about this particular week, again, recognizing that the Black Lives Matter Week of Action is what's driving this particular set of programming here in the United States. And so just want to thank everyone for coming out, for bringing your full self, that we recognize Black Lives Matter as not just a political intervention in its own right, but a call to action. And that, we really must think about every day how we engage in this particular work. And although we did not create these particular systems, we do have a responsibility to dismantle them both within ourselves and within the systems external to us. We hope that you will critically continue this work beyond our shared space today by believing in Black people, by calling yourself and others into this work, and working to support Black freedom, dreaming, and actualization. Lastly, I just want to turn your attention to what we have coming up on Thursday, where we have two specific events, both of which have been entered into the chat. First, telling the stories that must be told, an inquiry into local Black history, which will be done here locally with the African American Museum of Washtenaw County and Dr. Kimberly Ransom. And then also Red Table Talk, experiencing Black joy in womanhood, experiencing Black joy in reflection. And both of these will happen on Thursday at various different times. And you can click the links there in the chat to get access to the registration. So again, we just like to take this moment to thank everyone for participating and engaging with us. And we look forward to doing so again in the future. Again, panelists, if you can just hang out and stay for a little bit, we'll just have one more thing to do to wrap up. But other than that, thank you all, and we will see you next time.